Rain fell steadily on the old tiled roof, each drop breaking like a mournful note against the window pane. Elena Marin stood still before the small shrine tucked into the corner of her living room. A flickering candle offered the only light, its flame reflected in the worn glass of a silver frame, where Michael's radiant smile would remain frozen forever. They had been married for 2 days. Just 2 days. Then the accident happened, and he left this world without warning. Like everyone Elena had ever loved, her parents, her aunt who raised her, Michael too, had been stolen away by life's cruelty, leaving her alone in the house they had bought to begin a future. Her trembling fingers brushed the edge of the frame. The wedding ring on her 4th finger caught the candlelight, and it ached. She was a widow at 28. The word felt foreign, like an oversized coat thrown onto her shoulders without permission. "What did I do wrong?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, from sleepless nights, from the hollow condolences of strangers who didn't even know her name. The beauty she had once worn with pride now felt like a burden. Thick black hair, amber-toned skin, deep, warm eyes, everything about her seemed to amplify the whispers. The beautiful widow lives alone, as if her looks were something to be punished. In the small town of Willow Ridge, autumn continued its gentle rhythm, indifferent to private grief. But inside a modest house at the end of Maple Street, Elena remained still, like a ghost, unmoving in a quiet room, surrounded only by flickering candlelight and memory. Elena couldn't remember how long she'd sat beside the shrine. Maybe hours, maybe days. Time had lost its shape since Michael died. Everything melted into a thick fog of grief where concepts like morning or evening no longer mattered. Only memory remained sharp. She remembered how Michael smiled when the morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, remembered the day they volunteered together at the town's homeless shelter, how he had knelt beside her with a modest ring and whispered, "You were born to heal others. I want to do that with you. Always." She had laughed through tears that day, thinking it was the beginning of a long, happy life. But now that same sentence echoed inside her like a soft but aching reminder. After the funeral, when the last casserole-begaring neighbor had left, Elena remained in the empty house. She had no family to return to, no one to call home. The calls had stopped, the sympathy had faded, the silence settled in like dust. It was in that silence that she walked into the kitchen, took out her largest pot, and began chopping vegetables. There was no plan, no noble intention, just a simple act. Cooking. She placed the soup pot on the stove, tasted for salt, sighed. Then she reached for flour, water, and kneaded dough, her fingers moving methodically, as if each motion kept a part of herself from unraveling. That first day, no one came. But the next day, a man stood on the porch, drenched from the rain, asking if there was anything warm to eat. Elena handed him a bowl of soup and a small loaf of bread, wordless. The day after, there were 3. A week later, 8. No one asked why she was doing it. She never explained. She just opened the door, cooked, set the table, and watched as strangers ate with quiet gratitude. The house, once meant for children, family dinners, and a shared future, had become a refuge, not for Elena, but for others, the ones the world had forgotten too. One evening, while washing the last pot, Elena sank to the kitchen floor. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something quietly return to her. Not joy, not comfort, but maybe, just maybe, purpose. At first, Elena didn't notice the shift. Just a familiar neighbor who no longer waved as she passed. A woman who had once offered her condolences now stared with eyes colder than frost. But the change became clearer and crueler. When she entered the grocery store, conversations halted mid-sentence. Glances turned from subtle to blatant. Someone murmured just loud enough behind her, "She calls that charity?" At church, the pews around her were always empty, the same church where she used to sit among friends. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, but his eyes rarely left her. Elena sat straight, gaze fixed on the altar, but inside she was crumbling. The whispers cut deeper than any knife. She was no longer the grieving young widow. She had become the woman who lets men into her house. No one noticed the soup pots. No one smelled the fresh bread she baked each morning. They only saw worn shoes by her door, shadowed figures leaving with wrapped loaves, and they filled in the rest with their own judgment. One rainy afternoon, Elena stepped outside to get the mail and froze. Her mailbox had been spray-painted in harsh red, hypocrite. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a rag. The rain blurred the paint into dripping streaks. Her tears joined the smear, washing down the metal as she scrubbed over and over. She thought of Michael. Would he understand? Could he see how hard she was trying? At night, Elena collapsed at the base of the shrine, curling into herself like a child. "I've lost everything," she sobbed. "You, Aunt Becca, Mom, Dad, now even my dignity. I can't live like this." The photograph remained silent. Michael's smile, forever warm, unchanged by grief or time. Elena pressed her palms together, not in ritual but in desperation. Her words weren't a prayer. They were a cry flung into the void. "Please give me strength to keep going," she whispered. Or, "Please take me with you." Outside, the rain didn't let up. But within Elena, something began to solidify, as if, through every tear, a quiet resolve was being forged, silent but unbreakable. The rain that day lingered longer than usual. The sun had vanished by afternoon, and thick gray clouds draped over Willow Ridge like a damp blanket, heavy with old memories. Wind hissed through the bare maple trees, slipping through cracks in the windows like the sighs of restless ghosts. Elena sat in her kitchen, waiting for the soup to simmer. It was cold, and she had grown used to the solitude to the point that it barely registered anymore. A small radio crackled with distant jazz blending into the rain, creating a rhythm she no longer noticed. Then came the knock. Not timid like a neighbor's, not frantic like someone fleeing something. It was firm, 3 deliberate raps, as if the person outside wasn't afraid of the dark or the rain, but simply needed something. Elena hesitated for a few seconds, then walked to the door. A man stood there, soaked from head to toe, business clothes clinging to him, tie loose, glasses fogged. He looked to be in his 30s, dark brown hair plastered wet against his forehead, eyes gray-blue and guarded, but not arrogant. "Sorry," he said, voice low and even. "My car broke down near the fork. No signal. I saw your light on." Elena was silent. The wind pushed rain into the hallway, chilling the wooden floor. She looked at him, part wary, part compassionate. "Are you hungry?" she asked instead of answering. The man nodded. "Honestly, yes." She stepped aside. "Come in, dry off first." Graham Whitmore entered the small house of a woman whose name he didn't even know. The kitchen was warm and smelled of dill. Elena handed him an old towel and pointed to the chair by the stove. She didn't say much, and neither did he. The air between them wasn't awkward, just quiet. The kind of quiet shared by 2 adults, both carrying invisible wounds. "Today's soup has a hint of ginger," she said while ladling a bowl, "just enough to fight the cold." "Thank you," Graham said, hands shaking slightly. As the first spoonful touched his tongue, his eyes shut briefly. "God, it's been a long time since I had anything this warm." Elena smiled, so faintly she almost didn't notice herself doing it. "This place doesn't have much, just food and silence. Hope you don't mind either." "I needed both," he replied, his tone so honest it shifted the air between them. She sat across the table, holding her mug of tea. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask about his job or where he lived. Their conversation fell in quiet drops, like the rain outside. Sometimes strong, sometimes barely there. "Do you live here alone?" he asked eventually. Elena nodded. "Alone, but not entirely lonely." He tilted his head, curious. "There are people who stop by each day. They don't talk much. I cook, they eat. Sometimes we share silence, then they leave." Graham looked around. A small but carefully kept home. He noticed the neatly lined shoes by the door, towels drying properly over chairs, signs of someone living for others. "Thank you," he said again, "for the soup, for the home, for the peace." Elena looked at him, really looked, for the first time noticing those eyes, tired but not bitter, as if he too was running from something. "You can sleep on the sofa," she offered, "if the rain doesn't let up." He hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You're not," she interrupted gently. "Just don't snore too loud." And for the first time in many months, Elena heard laughter. Not her own, but from a stranger in a house that had long been filled only with silence. The kitchen light cast a golden hue across the worn wooden table. Elena placed 2 bowls of soup down side by side, as if Graham's presence had been anticipated, though it clearly hadn't. Rain still whispered against the window, drumming on the tin roof like a lullaby with no words. Graham took the seat across from her, the towel still draped over his shoulders. He looked like someone used to 5-star hotels, but strangely at peace in a stranger's kitchen. Elena's kitchen wasn't spacious, nor was it modern, but every detail, from the dried flowers in the corner to the old wooden clock, radiated warmth. "Where were you headed before the car gave up?" Elena asked, her voice as soft as steam. "Coming back from a talk in Boston," Graham replied. "I work with a nonprofit on renewable energy. Gave a presentation to a group of university students today. On the way home, the car decided to protest." Elena nodded, stirring her tea. "Talking to students sounds intelligent." Graham smiled faintly. "Not really. I just tell stories, hoping someone listens and chooses to do something good." "You talk like someone who's been hurt," Elena said. It wasn't quite a question. He didn't deny it. Instead, he met her gaze. "And you? The woman who cooks for strangers and never asks their names? Who are you in that story?" Elena pressed her lips together. "I used to teach art at the town's elementary school until I lost my husband. Then I stopped teaching." Graham nodded. No questions, no pressure for details. That silence in itself felt like respect. "People think I'm crazy," she said after a while. "Or filthy. Someone spray-painted my mailbox with things I won't repeat." "Because you help people?" he asked. "Because they don't understand. And they don't want to." They both fell quiet. Only the sound of spoon meeting bowl filled the air. Elena sighed, her hand brushing the rim of her teacup. "I don't need them to understand, I just need to keep going." Graham tilted his head, gaze softening. "I think that's enough." Elena looked at him, and for the first time, didn't feel judged, didn't feel examined, just sat beside another human being, unhidden. After the meal, she gathered the dishes. Graham offered to help, but she declined with a weary smile. "You rest. I'm used to doing this alone." He stood there for a moment, then moved to the living room. Elena heard the soft sound of him adjusting the pillows on the sofa, then the radio clicking on, another old jazz tune. She washed the dishes slowly. The water was warm, the soap smelt faintly of lavender. The air didn't feel as heavy as it usually did. Something very small had shifted. A rainy night, a stranger, a shared meal, and a fleeting sense of peace. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cold. Pale sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting soft beams across the wooden floor. Elena woke early as always, brewed coffee, wiped the counters, and checked the pantry. Graham was still asleep, curled on the sofa, looking more at peace than she would have expected. She planned to let him rest longer, but the knock at the door came sudden, urgent, not courteous like the one the night before. When Elena opened it, Mrs. Flanders, her neighbor 2 houses down, stood there with sharp eyes. Behind her were 2 other women Elena didn't know by name, but recognized from church. "Who is he?" Mrs. Flanders asked immediately, skipping pleasantries. Elena tilted her head slightly. "He's a traveler. His car broke down." "A traveler. Stayed the night." The woman's tone was laced with accusation. One of the women behind her clicked her tongue. The other muttered, "No wonder the mailbox got painted." Elena's hand tightened on the doorframe. She said nothing. She didn't need to. These people weren't here for truth. They were here to protect their own ideas of morality. Inside, Graham stirred at the sound of voices. He stood, walked toward the doorway, his hair still tousled, but his eyes alert. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing from Elena to the three women. Elena looked at him, then back. "Nothing. They're just concerned." Concerned about what? That a kind woman gave a stranger shelter for one night? His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. The two women behind Mrs. Flanders flinched slightly. Mrs. Flanders opened her mouth to retort, but Graham didn't stop. "If you must know, my name is Graham Whitmore. I'm not homeless. I'm not exploiting her. I'm someone whose car broke down and was fortunate enough to meet kindness in a town full of judgment." No one responded. Silence hung in the air for several beats. Then Mrs. Flanders turned and walked away, pulling the other two with her. Elena closed the door slowly, exhaling. Graham looked at her. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gotten involved, but—" "It's okay," she interrupted. "I've lived long enough with my own silence. Maybe it's time another voice spoke." He nodded. A quiet understanding settled between them, needing no further explanation. A few hours later, as Graham prepared to leave, his car now towed and repaired, he turned and placed a business card on the kitchen counter. "If anything happens, call me. Or, if nothing happens and you just want to talk, I'll listen." Elena picked up the card, eyes tracing the name printed in bold but simple letters. She didn't promise to call, but she didn't throw it away either. When the door closed, the house returned to quiet. But this quiet wasn't as heavy as before. She poured another cup of tea, placed the card on the wooden shelf near the shrine. A small gesture, a quiet reminder that maybe not everyone is eager to judge. Graham left Willow Ridge on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. No grand goodbye, no promises, just a glance from behind the wheel, a small nod, and the simple words, "Thank you for not closing the door." Elena assumed he would disappear like so many others, but 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Handwritten, thick paper, slanted and consistent script, a bit rushed but deeply sincere. In it, Graham recalled that rainy night, not in details but in feelings. The warmth of the kitchen, the ginger in the soup, the unspoken quiet that didn't judge. At the end, he wrote, "I didn't think I came there to be helped, but when I left, I realized I'd been saved in a very particular way." Elena read it, folded it gently, and placed it in an old wooden box where she once kept Michael's letters. She didn't write back, but a few days later, another letter came. The second letter was about his mother, a woman who had left him as a child and suddenly returned. Graham wrote about his anger, his confusion, and the fear of being hurt again. "I'm not sure why I'm writing this," he said, "but somehow, when I think of you, everything feels a little lighter." The letters that followed didn't come on any schedule, but each one made Elena pause her day to sit and read. Sometimes it was while her hands were still dusted with flour. Sometimes it was in the kind of silence where she could hear her own breathing. She still didn't write back. But strangely, Graham never asked her to. One night, when rain returned to Willow Ridge, not hard, but enough to stir old thoughts, Elena was rereading his latest letter when she heard a car stop in front of the house. When she opened the door, Graham stood under the porch without an umbrella, holding a stack of rain-dampened pages. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low and unsteady from the cold. "I never sent these, but tonight I want to read them to you." Elena didn't speak. She only nodded and stepped aside. No questions, no explanations. Graham stepped in, removed his coat, shook the rain off, and began reading. Letter by letter, word by word, things he hadn't had the courage to say, but had been honest enough to write. Some parts made him falter. Some parts made Elena look away to hide her tears. When the final letter was folded, Graham looked up. "I don't expect a response. I just needed you to know." Elena looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for not keeping it all inside." She laid her hand on the pages and gave a faint smile. Now, they're no longer letters never sent. A few days after the night Graham read his letters, he returned to Willow Ridge, this time in daylight, and this time with gardening gloves in hand. "You mentioned the garden in the back," he said, standing at Elena's porch with a modest smile. "I thought maybe we could grow something again." Elena looked at him through the doorframe. The garden, behind the house, the place where she and Michael had once planted their plans. Tomatoes, wild daisies, a strip of herbs near the steps. Now it was just dry soil, tangled weeds, and a few broken clay pots. "We?" she asked, not smiling, but not refusing. "Only if you're okay with it," Graham replied, gently, as if every word carried weight. Elena didn't answer. She nodded. They began the next morning. Graham brought tools, seeds, and bags of compost he'd gotten from an organic farm nearby. Elena brought tea, and the little radio on her windowsill played soft jazz, like the quiet soundtrack of an unspoken dream. They didn't talk much. Together, they turned the earth, pulled weeds, unearthed the dead roots. Morning sun warmed their backs, the scent of damp soil mixed with ginger tea. "Elena," Graham called softly as he uncovered a faint line of bricks beneath the overgrowth, the remnants of an old path Michael once laid. She knelt beside him, running her fingers over the stone. Cold, solid, still there, not forgotten, just buried by time and quiet. "My husband built this path. He wanted yellow daisies on both sides," she said, her voice steady, the first time she spoke of Michael without choking on the memory. Graham said nothing. He kept digging. When he reached the space between the two sides of the path, he opened a packet of daisy seeds. "Let's leave this part for the daisies," he said, "for what he started." Elena didn't respond, but something softened inside her, as if she'd been given permission to remember, without guilt. By noon they sat on the wooden steps, hands dirty, clothes streaked with soil, but both smiling, light, real smiles. "Do you think the garden will actually bloom?" Graham asked, looking out at the freshly turned soil. Elena followed his gaze. "I don't know, but I think it deserves the chance." He nodded, like people do. She turned to him, eyes gentle, "Like us." And for the first time, she wasn't only thinking of the past. She was present, in the moment, beside someone, on old ground, planting something not to replace what was lost, but to continue what was never finished. That afternoon, the rain came again. Not the fierce storm like the night Graham first knocked on her door, but a soft, steady drizzle, like the sky was whispering a lullaby to the earth. Elena stood by the window, a steaming cup of ginger tea in her hands, eyes watching the soaked garden outside. Graham was out there, covering the last flower bed with soil. His shirt was muddy, hair dripping wet, but his face remained calm, patient, as if the rain didn't bother him. If anything, it helped him focus. "Elena," he called, hand still in the dirt. "You know something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Know what?" "That as broken as my life has been, I've never seen anything recover as slowly and as honestly as this garden." Elena smiled, head lowered slightly to hide how deeply that line touched her. He wasn't just talking about the plants. A few minutes later, Graham set the shovel aside and stepped onto the porch, leaving muddy footprints on the wooden steps. She handed him a towel and they both sat down, watching the rain draw circles in the soil. "Aren't you bothered by the rain anymore?" she asked, her voice as soft as the steam rising between them. "No," Graham said. "I think I was more afraid of the things the rain reminded me of." Elena nodded. "I know that feeling." They sat quietly. In the rhythm of the rain, time seemed to slow. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was no longer a gap, but a space gently filled by presence. Elena looked at the man sitting beside her. Once a stranger, now the one who had shared his unsent letters. The one who had helped her dig life into an old garden. Something inside her was shifting. not a replacement. Michael was still there in memory, in the path of bricks, in the daisies yet to bloom. But Graham, he didn't try to fill that space. He simply sat beside it. "Do you think," she asked, "it's possible to love again, without betraying the love that came before?" Graham paused for a long moment. Then he answered, slowly, "I think love isn't about replacing. It's a new branch growing from an existing root. The root stays, but the new branch can still rise." Elena turned away, hiding the tremble in her expression. His words hit too close, too true. She didn't reply, but a while later, as she rose to refill the teapot, she said without looking back, "You can stay, if you'd like." Graham didn't answer, but the sound of his chair sliding closer under the porch roof was enough. That night, Elena wrote her first letter in a very long time. Not to Michael, not to Graham. There was no address, no recipient. Just words, written to release something she had carried too long. "I survived, Michael, even when I thought I wouldn't. I cooked, I was misunderstood, I hurt, and then someone walked through the rain like you once did and sat beside me, asking nothing. I haven't forgotten you, but I think, for the first time since everything, I'm giving myself permission to live, not just exist." She folded the letter and didn't seal it. She tucked it inside an old book on the table, beneath Michael's photo. Then she blew out the light. Outside, the rain kept falling. But this time, it didn't carry sorrow. It carried something else, something just beginning. Gentle, quiet, but real. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it was soft. Not loud, not vivid, just a quiet shift. Mornings grew warmer, the soil breathed again, and green sprouts appeared in a garden long believed to be gone. Elena noticed the first daisy on an April morning. She was watering the vegetables when she spotted it, a pale yellow bud rising between the rows, delicate but determined. She crouched beside it, afraid even a touch might harm its fragile strength. Graham stepped outside just then, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. "You saw it?" he asked, voice low, as if not to startle the flower. "It's a daisy," she whispered, exactly what he wanted. They stood together, watching that tiny bloom. Not for its beauty, but because it had survived. Winter, time, grief. "Do you think he'd be happy?" Graham asked. No name needed, she knew. Elena nodded. "Michael would smile, not because I'd forgotten, but because I kept going." Graham handed her the coffee and joined her on the wooden step. They sat in silence, watching the garden breathe again. Over the following weeks, the garden truly came to life. Tomatoes ripened, basil filled the air with its soft scent, and daisies stretched along the path as if Michael were whispering from somewhere, "I'm still here. I see it all." People began coming back to Elena's home. Familiar faces, Mrs. Geller, little Jude, and even those who had once avoided her gaze. They sat quietly beneath the trees, sipped warm soup, and left with gentle smiles. Graham didn't stay forever, but he always returned. Each time he brought something, a potted plant, a marked book, or just his steady presence. One still afternoon, while Elena was arranging daisies in a vase, Graham walked into the kitchen, holding something small. "There's something I'd like to give you," he said. It was a key, small, worn brass, strung on a piece of simple leather cord. Elena looked at him, puzzled. "What does it open?" Graham smiled gently and placed it in her hand. "It doesn't unlock a room," he said softly, "but it holds a promise. Whenever you're ready, tomorrow or years from now, this will still mean the same. My heart is yours to walk into." The kitchen went quiet. Even the music paused in that moment. Elena held the key, silent, but something inside her bloomed. No rush, no pressure, just peace, after a long journey of loss and healing. Moments passed. Then she looked up, met his gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think I'm finally ready." Outside, the daisies swayed in the breeze, and in the quiet between 2 cups of coffee and a blooming daisy, something new began. Not perfect, not planned, but honest.